Well, let's get more now on whether the government's new illegal migration bill will be able to put into effect. Concerns have been raised as to whether the proposed measures are in compliance with international law. Well, the illegal migration bill is broad in its sweep and its ambition. It would legislate a legal duty for the Home Secretary to remove anyone entering the UK illegally. The bill will allow the detention of illegal arrivals without judicial review for 28 days or until they can be removed. In 2021, the UK had just over 2,500 detention places. That's at current levels of migration, less than 20% of the capacity needed. Migrants won't be able to use modern slavery laws to stop their removal, and challenges will only be heard after they have left the UK. An annual cap on the number of refugees being accepted by the UK will be decided by MPs in Westminster. And migrants arriving by illegal routes risk a permanent ban on settlement, citizenship and re-entry to the UK. Well, a little earlier here on Sky News, the Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, defended this new bill. Joining me now, barrister and author Chris Daw KC. Thank you so much for joining us here on Sky News this afternoon. The story's been unfolding at pace today with regard to the legality of what the government is proposing. Suella Braverman appeared on Sky News this morning saying that it is legal, but in black and white on that legislation proposal, and what she told MPs is that it's 50-50. It's so confusing. What's your take on it?
It's completely unlawful in international law, and I can break it down for you in very straightforward terms. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights was passed in 1948 after the Second World War. It specifically provides that nations must allow refugees or asylum seekers to apply for asylum. That was followed up by the 1951 UN Convention on Refugees, which specifically states the following. Asylum seekers are not required to apply in the first country that they reach. They are entitled to apply in any country which is a signatory to the convention, and they are not required to arrive in that country by lawful or regular means. There is specific provision that asylum seekers are entitled to arrive by irregular means without documentation, because if you use any form of common sense, you'll realise that any genuine refugee is unlikely to have proper documentation, and therefore it's highly improbable that they will have any lawful route to apply to arrive in a country and then apply for asylum. They are, as I say, governed by the European Convention of Human Rights, which provides that anybody in the United Kingdom is protected by due process of law, cannot be imprisoned without a fair trial or any legal process. And I'm afraid this legislation breaks every single one of those fundamental pieces of human rights legislation, international law. And the irony of that is that the United Kingdom was the founding signatory of every single one of those documents, and it was involved in the creation of all of those basic human rights, unsurprisingly, because the United Kingdom was also the country which sacrificed most and fought hardest against tyranny, against the tyranny of the majority, which of course led to the deprivation of basic human rights in Germany and has done so in other countries around the world. So the United Kingdom has been historically at the forefront of protecting basic human rights. It's unimaginable from a legal point of view that you could detain someone without trial, without access to a lawyer, without access to the courts, and then deport them. I mean, it's just abominable from a human rights perspective and from an international legal perspective. We, the United Kingdom, will become an international human rights pariah if this legislation passes, comes into force, and is enacted in the way that it is. There is it's nothing about 50-50. There's no 50-50 about this. It is 100% certain that this legislation breaches the European Convention on Human Rights, and perhaps more importantly, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. We're going to breach that knowingly in this country. It's a disgrace, and the government knows it's unlawful, and they know, frankly, it's the only way they're going to get votes at the next election.
I'm just going to let some of that sink in, because that's very powerful, what you're saying there. And again, I'm just casting my mind back to earlier today, the Home Secretary sitting in Sky News studio speaking to us, saying this was legal. The Home Secretary has a legal background. She says she has armies of lawyers that have poured over this. My question would be, could she have got this wrong? Or could she have got this wrong? Is that even feasible? From what you're saying, it doesn't seem that you think it is. So I wonder what's at play here.
Well, it's obvious that politics is at play. We have a desperate government, which is desperate on so many fronts, domestically and economically, in terms of the health service, in terms of standard of living, in terms of cost of living, all of these other issues. Basic services are falling apart. Massive waits in the NHS, and ambulances unavailable. Often people dying because ambulances are not coming. If this government was to fight the next election on the basis of domestic issues, economic issues, and such like, they know they will be wiped out. So what they're doing is, when any government is that desperate, they know they're going to face utter ruin at a general election, they pick on a minority group and they try to get people to get angry and antagonized against that minority group. And this is a classic example. It's the same playbook used by Donald Trump in the United States about immigrants over the Mexican border, and it was successful for him, and the government are hoping it will be successful for them. But to answer your very straightforward question, is there any doubt about the legal position such that the Home Secretary could legitimately claim that there's a possible interpretation that this is lawful? The answer is no, and I'll tell you why. Because the bill itself, at the top of the bill, says the Home Secretary cannot assert as a matter of law that this act is compliant with the European Convention on Human Rights. That's written at the very top of the legislation. There's no mention of the United Nations Convention on Refugees, because there's no requirement to include a mention of that in UK legislation, and that's why it's not there. But the UN itself, so the UNHCR, which enforces the UN Convention on Human Rights, on refugees, has said and has issued a statement just yesterday saying this legislation breaches the UN Convention on Refugees, is a fundamental breach of the United Kingdom's obligations in international law, and is something that is extremely dangerous and should not happen.
Chris, I get
There's
that.
no legal doubt in any lawyer's mind at all that this is unlawful.
I get that, but you've got the Prime Minister standing up this week, acknowledging the legal battles that lie ahead, more so than the Home Secretary seems to be, but saying that he is up for the fight. If this were to be passed into law, where does that leave the UK government?
Where it leaves the UK as a country and our nation is that the European Court of Human Rights will undoubtedly declare that this is unlawful, will, I suspect, issue injunctions to prevent people being deported under this legislation. And that will leave, and I suspect quite deliberately, that will leave the United Kingdom Parliament and government on a direct collision course with membership of the European Convention on Human Rights. The Parliament will have a choice, either to accept that ruling, to follow international law and not to deport people with no process of law, including the majority of genuine refugees. Because this is the irony. The Home Office's own figures make clear that the majority of those arriving on small boats would qualify for asylum status and would be allowed to remain if there was a proper and efficient process for them to be taken through the court process. And so where we end up is, I'm afraid, that the government are going to very soon after this comes into effect, are going to be faced with a choice. Do we have a vote in Parliament to come out of the European Convention of Human Rights? I suspect the answer is they will try and achieve that, and Tory members may well vote for it. The next thing that will happen is that the United Nations will say that the United Kingdom is in breach of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the UN Convention on Refugees, and we will be a pariah nation amongst civilized states, because no other civilized state has faced such a ruling from so many international bodies. And do we care about international law in a country that fought so hard to bring all of these international laws and protections into place in the first place? I really hope we do. And I hope that the next election isn't a tyranny of the majority situation where voters vote for something on an emotive basis, which in truth is utterly, utterly despicable and shouldn't be allowed to take place.
Chris Daw KC, barrister, thank you for the benefit of your expertise here this afternoon. You feel that international law will be broken, and you've outlined the case very effectively and passionately for us today here on Sky News. We really appreciate it. Thank you. We'll be discussing this story throughout the day here on Sky News.